Tonight, the story of Flight 447. It has been called the Titanic of air disasters, a passenger aircraft so advanced that the chance of it falling out of the sky is unthinkable. But on a stormy June night in 2009, that's just what happened to an Air France A330. Its terrifying descent into the Atlantic Ocean took just 4 minutes. For 3 years, what happened inside the cockpit remained a mystery. But as you'll see now, the black box tapes have revealed a shocking and scary scenario of how quickly and easily a high-tech passenger plane can crash. May 31st, 2009. Air France Flight 447 is taxiing, about to set off from Rio de Janeiro for Paris. All is normal on the flight deck.
It was one of the world's great aeroplanes, latest technology, superb engineering, and operated by one of the world's great airlines.
But this plane would simply vanish over the Atlantic Ocean.
There was no call from the aeroplane. It was just lost, and it was unthinkable that that could just go missing without a word.
228 lives are lost.
You feel alone, very alone. Your daughter and her husband are not there anymore.
Now, black box recordings have been recovered from the cockpit. These incredible tapes reveal the final, terrifying minutes on the flight deck. Solving one of aviation's greatest mysteries and challenging every notion of modern air safety.
This is a systemic problem the industry has got, and it's not doing anything about it.
Rio de Janeiro, Galeão International Airport, 7 p.m. local time. Air France Flight 447, an Airbus A330, is taking off for the 11-hour journey to Charles de Gaulle Airport in Paris.
Air France is a great airline. The A330 is the latest generation of airplane.
The aircraft is so advanced, aviation experts say it almost flies itself.
On long-haul flights, pilots get about 3 minutes of actual flying, just from takeoff to wheels up, and then wheels down to landing.
International air safety specialist David Learmount has studied the Air France catastrophe extensively.
That an aircraft like that could possibly go missing, especially without saying a word.
And he concludes that modern aviation has become more dependent on computers than pilots.
The airline tells pilots nowadays, you cannot possibly fly this airplane as accurately as the automatics can, so don't even try. Now, if you've been training your pilots, never take over. If they've never been getting any practice, if they don't have any faith in their ability to fly anymore, what have you got? You've got a passenger.
On board are 228 people from 32 different countries. Most are French, like Caroline Soulas and her husband, Air France flight attendant Sebastian Vedavati. They've just had 3 days off together in Rio.
Sébastien and Caroline, it's like Romeo and Juliet, because they have met in a plane and they got married 2 years after.
Just before boarding Flight 447, Caroline sends a text message to her mother, Corinne.
The last SMS she sent was saying, it's a pity to come back to France. It's so sunny here. It was Sunday in the evening, so I knew that she was in the plane.
The takeoff is flawless. The plane heads north. At 1:35 a.m., Flight 447 leaves Brazilian airspace and makes final radio contact with Brazilian air traffic control.
Your traffic, my friend.
The plane now enters a radar dark spot in the middle of the Atlantic. Until it comes within range of air traffic control in Dakar, Senegal, Flight 447 won't be seen on radar screens. But the pilots can still communicate by radio.
They had any number of means to communicate with the rest of the world what was going on. They could talk to other aeroplanes in the vicinity if they wanted messages relayed. So they could have given us a message. In this world of satellite communications, you don't expect what happened to Air France 447 to happen.
3:45 a.m., 2.5 hours after leaving Brazilian airspace, there's been no contact from Flight 447. By now, it should have appeared on the radar screens in Dakar.
The fact that we hadn't heard anything from the aircraft that went missing when it had the means of communicating to any number of people was surprising in its own right, but it's a significant piece of evidence.
Did you allow yourself to hope for a miracle, or, as far as you were concerned, all was lost?
Like everybody else, my reaction was shock, but I think everybody knew it must have gone missing.
Families and friends gather to meet the flight at Charles de Gaulle Airport. There were many planes landing here in Paris on that very long evening, but Air France Flight 447 had simply vanished. There was no Mayday call, no trace on radar, and certainly no witnesses. Eventually, Air France had to make that dreadful announcement. The flight could no longer be in the air, and all 228 passengers on board had been lost.
This is a catastrophe, undoubtedly, and we have lost an aircraft with 228 people on board.
And at the moment, I shout because I was alone at home, and I thought that it was the end.
Caroline's father, Robert, was working overseas when he got the call.
I was alone, and a friend of mine called me because my wife couldn't do it. Called me and tell me, do you know there has been a crash on Air France plane, and we suppose that there is no survivor.
Clues to what happened to Flight 447 are frustratingly few.
Aviation authorities and the distressed families of those on board can only assume some outside force has brought down the plane.
And the fact that there was no distress signal, what does that say to you?
It could be, dare I say, a bomb or something like that.
French authorities suspect a terrorist attack. Search teams are scouring half an ocean because only the wreckage of Flight 447 can reveal whether a bomb caused its destruction.
Now, we knew that the aeroplane was not just going to fall apart in the sky. Aeroplanes just don't do that. Aeroplanes are better engineered now than they've ever been in history.
After 5 days' frantic search, fragments of the plane's wreckage and 50 bodies are discovered nearly 1,000 kilometers off the coast of Brazil. The find rules out a bomb because Flight 447 was intact when it hit the water. But with 600 Airbus A330s in daily service worldwide, including 36 now flying in Australia, there's a new fear. Could this ultra-modern airliner have a fatal and unknown flaw? It's been described in some circles as the Titanic of the skies.
In many ways, it's not at all like the Titanic. The Titanic sank for a very good reason, a reason you could see and feel. It was an iceberg and it hit one. This airplane didn't really have any problems and it went missing anyway.
But the search for answers would come to resemble the search for the Titanic. The truth about Flight 447 is locked inside its black box cockpit recorders, but they are somewhere on the seabed 4 kilometers down. French authorities throw everything into the deep-sea hunt, from a nuclear submarine to remote mini-subs capable of operating at extreme depths. It's a search followed by air safety experts around the world, like Bill Voss.
The black boxes were the crucial piece, which is, of course, why incredible amounts of time and treasure were spent by the French government and others. Many assisted trying to find these things. And it was an extraordinary search effort.
Weeks turned to months, then years. But just as it seemed the mystery of Flight 447 would never be solved, the American team that found the Titanic was called in. On the 2nd of April 2011, nearly 2 years after the crash, the plane's shattered fuselage was finally found 4,000 meters beneath the surface. With it, the all-important black boxes.
When they did find them, it changed everything, because now we started really getting a clear picture.
There were also 104 bodies, many still strapped in their seats. But there was no trace of the remaining 74 passengers, including Caroline Soulas.
But not being able to recover her body.
It was another death. In this story, Karen has disappeared many times. Each step was another
nightmare.
Another nightmare.
Coming up, the black box recordings give up their secrets. Air France Flight 447's final 4 minutes.
They knew. All 3 pilots knew they were about to die.
Chaos in the cockpit. In the early hours of June the 1st, 2009, Air France Flight 447 slammed into the South Atlantic Ocean. It disappeared without warning, without any distress call. Exactly how and why 228 people died had become one of modern aviation's great mysteries. The only hope for an answer, finding the flight's black boxes 4 kilometers down on the seabed. After 2 years and an underwater search more expensive than any other in history, Flight 447's black boxes had finally been recovered. But would they provide the answer to one of modern aviation's most urgent questions? How had one of the world's safest and most advanced passenger jets simply fallen from the sky? The audio recordings recovered from Flight 447's black boxes have never been made public, but using their actual transcript, we've recreated the final terrifying minutes leading up to the crash. Flight 447 departs Rio de Janeiro and flies north along Brazil's east coast, bound for Paris. Captain of the Airbus A330 is 58-year-old Marc Dubois. He has almost 11,000 flying hours to his name and is a veteran of the Rio-Paris route. The second pilot is David Robert, aged 37. He's done more than 6,500 hours. The third pilot is Pierre-Cédric Bonnier. His wife is also on tonight's flight. Bonnier is 32, and with just under 3,000 flying hours, is the least experienced member of the crew. Bonnier is in the right-hand seat of the cockpit, with Captain Dubois on the left. David Robert is on his sleep break in the small cabin behind the cockpit.
They're making radio calls, passing position reports to air traffic control. It's all pretty quiet. In the middle of the Atlantic, in the middle of the night, there's not much to do.
In the passenger cabin, dinner has been served and the cabin lights dimmed. It is 8 hours to Paris and many of those making the flight are settling into sleep. there's also a relaxed mood in the cockpit.
Tout va bien? Tout va bien. Tout va bien? Pas de café, de thé? Tout va bien.
There was a bit of chop. You know, the aeroplane was chopping around a little bit. It wasn't severe.
Aviation safety specialist David Learmount has studied the transcripts of Flight 447's cockpit recordings.
It was quite clear that they had a good situational awareness of the fact that there were cumulonimbus clouds which they would have to avoid, which is all standard stuff in that part of the world.
C'est l'équateur. J'avais compris, je suppose. Non, je m'en doutais.
As they fly towards the equator, the weather begins to deteriorate. This zone is infamous for its severe thunderstorms, with massive clouds impossible for commercial planes to fly over.
Sometimes you've really got to think about which route you're going to take and which headings you're going to take up to try and avoid them.
Meteorologist Michael de Villiers has analysed the weather on that night.
What it shows there is the areas that were forecast on the significant weather chart where there would be thunder activity, quite a few around. Thunderstorms are probably the most dangerous form of weather. It's strong updrafts and downdrafts, can knock the aircraft around, can also cause structural damage if a thunderstorm is severe enough. You get icing, you get the hail, you get lightning, which can also damage an aircraft.
But Captain Dubois doesn't seem that worried and keeps Flight 447 on its current heading.
Il neige. 209 nœuds. Il y a un truc droit devant, et il y en a un autre derrière. Hein? Oh merde, non. Baisse un peu la lumière intérieure pour voir dehors. Ouais. J'allume les feux pour voir. Ah voilà. Quoi? On dirait qu'on va rentrer dans les zones nuageuses.
Navigating around storm clouds it's not demanding. You look at them, if they're in front of you, you turn left or turn right and you fly round them. I mean, this is not difficult stuff.
The thunderstorms also generate bright flashes of what's known as St. Elmo's fire, caused by ice pellets discharging electricity on the aircraft's windscreen.
J'avais pas l'impression qu'il allait y avoir de l'orage. Bon, bah y a plus qu'à le réveiller, hein, c'est ça?
Still, it's not so serious that Captain Dubois won't take a sleep break, and before he does, establishes who will fly the plane in his absence.
Ouais, c'est qui le pose? C'est toi? Bon, il va prendre ma place.
Dubois decides the least experienced pilot Bonnier is in control of the plane, not David Robert, who's now back in the cockpit from his sleep break.
Bon, allez, je me casse. Bon, ça va. Bon, les petites turbulences qu'on vient d'avoir, on va aller même après.
The weather gets worse, and in the cockpit, the most junior pilot is in charge.
Vache, heureusement que c'était la 330, hein. C'est clair. Tu veux pas tirer un peu plus sur la gauche, là? Excuse-moi? J'ai dit, tu veux pas un peu plus tirer sur la gauche?
Then, just after 2 a.m., the black boxes record a loud noise in the cockpit. Experts believe it's caused by ice crystals striking the aircraft. An alarm suddenly sounds. It warns the crew that the autopilot has shut down.
J'ai les commandes. D'accord.
With the autopilot off, Bonnier, in the right-hand seat, is now in manual control of the aircraft. Robert, despite being more experienced, is now effectively co-pilot.
Remember, this is 2 o'clock in the morning, on a very dark night, no moon. They can't see a natural horizon. In terms of human alertness, these guys in the seats were at their period of lowest possible alertness, okay? And all of a sudden, they're woken up by this blaring, this hooter sound that the autopilot is disconnected.
What neither man realizes is that the freezing temperature outside has caused ice to block 3 critical speed sensors called pitos. The blocked speed sensors cause the autopilot to temporarily shut down, but there is no emergency. The plane is still in level flight. All that Bernier at the controls has to do is maintain that level flight.
For a reason we will never know, he pulled back quite dramatically on his side stick. There was no reason to do this. Absolutely none. Okay? It was like he got a shock.
By pulling back on the control stick, Bernier puts the aircraft into a steep climb. If there is a single moment that dooms Air France Flight 447, this is it.
If he'd done nothing, the accident would not have happened, because in less than a minute, the pitot tubes cleared themselves of ice and everything went back to normal. All they needed to do was just to keep flying like it was.
Ça n'affiche pas la bonne vitesse.
The aircraft is now climbing rapidly and losing speed.
Because he was going uphill into very thin air that the aircraft couldn't be supported by while it was at its weight, the aircraft started slowing down. I don't think you'll ever understand how baffling this is to aviators like myself, to say how could they not have recognized what had happened.
Coming up, they start to stall.
They started to stall.
The Atlantic Ocean is 40,000 feet below. And Flight 447 is in free fall.
The aircraft starts to drop. It starts to fall. It stops flying, starts falling.
The final moments of Air France 447. The Airbus A330, with 228 people on board, is high above the Atlantic Ocean when it begins to fall out of the sky and hurtles towards the sea at 10,000 feet a minute. But there is no distress call, and there is nothing mechanically wrong with the aircraft. It can still fly, but it isn't. The black box recordings revealed the frantic scramble by pilots to correct the aircraft. These are those final, fateful moments of Air France 447. A blocked speed sensor on the exterior of Air France 447's fuselage has frozen over and shut down the autopilot.
Ça n'affiche pas la bonne vitesse.
The man now manually flying the Airbus A330, Pierre-Cédric Bernier, is the least experienced pilot on the flight deck. He's put the aircraft into a steep climb, so steep it begins to stall.
A stall happens when the aircraft is going too slowly for the wings to produce sufficient lift, and therefore the aircraft starts to drop, it starts to fall. It stops flying, starts falling.
Bernier needs to act quickly to stop the plane falling. But at that moment, one of the blocked speed sensors comes back online. The pilots are now getting real instrument readings, but they don't believe them. It's a recipe for total confusion, says flight safety specialist Bill Voss.
Now, some new sensors come back in with valid information that didn't look valid because everything else was so totally messed up. And that's really where things went from a very benign circumstance to a rapidly escalating, out-of-control circumstance.
Air safety specialist David Learmount has studied these final minutes of Flight 447 and the fateful decisions made in the cockpit.
And then when they looked up and they saw the airplane with a combination of terribly low airspeed and a very high nose attitude, They didn't understand how they got there, even though they themselves had put it there. They didn't understand how they got there, and they never did understand. For the rest of that short flight, they didn't understand what was going on.
Fais attention à ta vitesse. Fais attention à ta vitesse. Ok, je redescends. Stabilise. Ouais.
Co-pilot Robert tries to call Captain Dubois back from his break and onto the flight deck.
Merde, il est où?
Stall.
Il vient ou il vient pas?
Dubois does not respond. Air France 447 reaches nearly 40,000 feet above the sea before it starts to drop.
J'ai plus le contrôle de l'avion là.
Stall.
J'ai plus du tout le contrôle de l'avion.
A minute after Robert's call, Captain Dubois returns to the cockpit.
Qu'est-ce qui se passe là? Qu'est-ce que vous foutez? Mais qu'est-ce qui se passe? Je sais pas ce qui se passe. Le contrôle de l'avion. On a totalement perdu le contrôle de l'avion. On comprend rien. On a tout tenté.
When the captain comes back into the cockpit, the aircraft is beyond, it's topped out, it's stalled, and it's now descending with its nose very high. Very little forward speed, but it's got a huge rate of descent.
The Airbus A330 is now plunging towards the ocean at 10,000 feet a minute.
On n'a pas une seule indication valide.
On this moonless night, the pilots have no idea they're just 3 minutes from crashing into the sea.
And of course, they wouldn't have been able to see the surface of the sea or the surface of the Earth at all because it was too dark.
There's still time to pull out of the stall, but the pilots mistakenly believe the plane is traveling too fast.
The noise, the aerodynamic noise, you know when you're in an aeroplane, you can hear the air rushing past the fuselage, but this was a completely different noise, much louder than the noises you normally hear. And they misinterpreted this as the aircraft overspeeding, when exactly the opposite was true. It's just total pilot misinterpretation. It was pilot panic, really.
The crew has now just seconds to push the aircraft's nose down and try to recover from the stall. But Bonnier is still pulling back on the stick, which neither of the other pilots can see from where they're sitting.
What they needed to do, because the airplane was so deeply stalled, was to dramatically push the stick forward, because there was nothing wrong with the airplane at all. Not a soul, not a dicky bird wrong with the airplane.
Stall.
Non, tu montes là.
Stall.
Je monte là? Ok, alors on descend. Tu montes? Merde, c'est pas possible.
The stall warning alarm has rung 58 times. Now it cuts out.
And the computer stopped telling the pilots that the aircraft was stalled because it had gone into realms that the computer just didn't recognize.
The crew and passengers of Air France 447 now have less than a minute to live. The plane reaches the point of no return, 10,000 feet above the sea.
Ça y est, on va arriver au niveau 100 là.
That flying through, they saw flight level 100, which is 10,000 feet. I think that was a point where we went from, we have some time to figure this thing out, to like, we might not be able to save ourselves.
How would it have been for the passengers, do you think?
Well, I hope is that most of them were asleep. It was 2 o'clock in the morning, but I think an awful lot of them wouldn't have been. And some of them who were would have been woken up. And when they were woken up, they would have heard this very unfamiliar noise. The airplane would have been juddering and buffeting, and they would have known something was very, very wrong. The passengers, I'm not sure what they would have made of it.
Doesn't bear thinking about.
I have wondered, but I don't think you can even guess.
Remonte. Mais je cabre à fond là depuis tout à l'heure.
Captain Dubois suddenly realizes what Bonnier has been doing all along, pulling back on the stick, pushing the aircraft's nose up and stalling it.
Non, ne remonte pas. Non, alors descends. Alors donne-moi les commandes. À moi les commandes. Vas-y, t'as les commandes. Attention, tu cabres là. Je cabre. Là, il faudrait là. On est à 4000 pieds. Tu cabres là.
The aircraft passes through 2,000 feet. Its ground proximity warning system detects the ocean below, and its alarm rings out.
Allez, tire. Allez, on tire. On va taper. Non, mais c'est pas vrai. Mais qu'est-ce qui se passe? 10 degrés d'assiette.
They knew, all three pilots knew they were about to die because they could see that they'd completely run out of height. And the last couple of seconds, they'd just given up.
The recording ends at 14 minutes and 28 seconds past 2 a.m. Sebastian Vedavati and Caroline Soulat met on an Air France flight to San Francisco in 2003. Just 6 years later, they were killed aboard Air France 447. Sebastian's body was recovered. Caroline's was never found.
They were a couple. Sebastian's body has been retrieved and Caroline no. So it means that they are separated now forever. I hope she didn't feel anything before the impact, before the crash, I hope. I'm not sure of this.
It's afterwards, you feel alone, very alone, and you don't realize that your daughter and her husband are not there anymore.
If ever an air disaster was caused by pilot error, it would seem to be this one. But many experts blame the aviation industry itself for insisting its pilots rely almost entirely on their aircraft's automatic systems, effectively training them not to fly.
If these pilots were not prepared for a situation like this, it's much more than pilot error, it's system error. Blame these individuals if you like, but if you want to do that, you will be missing the entire point. This is a systemic problem the industry has got, and it's not doing anything about it.
So it could happen again.
It could happen again.
Hello, I'm Sarah Arbo. Thanks for watching. To keep up with the latest from 60 Minutes Australia, make sure you subscribe to our channel. You can also download the 9Now app for full episodes and other exclusive 60 Minutes content.